Well, a third place finish in the PK85 was not what anyone had in mind for the Zags, but there's a lot to like after this team's gutsy win over Xavier on Sunday.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to give you daily reports through what is clearly going to be an up and down roller coaster season of Gonzaga hoops. All right, it is Monday, but it is not Mailbag Monday. We are pushing that again to Tuesday so we can talk about this Xavier game. What a gutsy, really nice performance from the Gonzaga Bulldogs to absorb a punch from Sean Miller's Musketeers, let them get back into the game, and then still crawl back and secure a victory and a third place finish in Portland. I know that it's been a challenge to watch the Zags the last couple of games as they have had a couple of blowouts, which is very unusual for the Bulldogs, and some close calls against teams that we're not used to seeing them have close calls against. But I think the fact that they have two really gutsy come from behind victories against very good teams in Michigan State and Xavier is a testament to the will and the fight that this team has, and the ability that they clearly have, even when they are not playing at their best, when they haven't put all of the pieces together just yet. It's hard to obviously see them lose games the way that they have lost games, and we will clearly talk more about that as the offseason goes on, and we'll talk more about it on Mailbag Monday. Lots of questions after the Purdue game came forward, as you can probably imagine. I want to focus on the Xavier game today because that is the newest update. And of course, I'm a fairly relentlessly positive person on the podcast, so we are going to stick with some of the positive stuff, at least for now. And the Zags won. They defeated Xavier 88-84, third place finish in PK85. Julian Strawther was the reason that they secured a victory here. He had a career-high 23 points coming off of a really rough game against Purdue. For him to bounce back from that game, go 5 of 8 from deep, score 10 points in the final few minutes, hit 2 trays that basically buried Xavier at the end of the game. Really clutch, really critical shots. The Zags absolutely needed them. He came off some screens, had some open looks, and just knocked them down. Sean Miller extremely praised Julian Strawther really a lot after the game, talked about how he was a huge part of the game, how his shots at the end of the game were the biggest shots of the game, and had a lot of nice words to say about Julian, which it's always nice to see opposing coaches praise players. He also, we'll talk a lot more about Ben Gregg later in the episode, but Sean Miller also took some time specifically to talk to Ben Gregg, who he had recruited when he was at Arizona. So nice to see him kind of give some praise there. But this was a really critical game for Julian, and what it really showed us for Gonzaga fans is that there is a player that the Zags can rely on when Drew isn't having his best game. And unfortunately, Julian hasn't been extremely consistent yet this year, and that is what Gonzaga is missing, is a consistent secondary star. It's why Chet Holmgren and Andrew Nembhard were just so critical to Gonzaga's team last year, because either of them could have been that guy. And now when Drew doesn't have a particularly great game, he did not play well in the first half of this game. 4 points and 4 fouls in the first half for Drew Timme, 2 of 7 shooting. He, of course, rebounded in the second half, as we're used to seeing him do. 16 points. He finished with 7 assists as well. He also had 7 turnovers, which we have talked about Drew Timme's turnover issues, and I have kind of taken the stance that as a big man who has the ball in his hands an incredibly high rate, just a large amount of time. Armando Bacot for North Carolina also has significant turnover issues, and it's kind of the same thing. If you come down the floor and the immediate first thing you do is put the ball in a big man's hand, whether he's 5 feet, 8 feet, 15 feet, 25 feet away from the basket, and you let him go to work, you're kind of accepting that there's going to be some turnovers. Having said that, 7 turnovers is too many. Cannot be turning the ball over 7 times in a game. The Zags did great with turnovers in this game. They had 13 turnovers. That means that the rest of the team had just 6 turnovers compared to Drew Timme, who had 7. That's really good. Nolan Hickman didn't have turnover issues. Julian Strawther, who has had significant he's been one of the biggest issues for Gonzaga with regards to turnovers. He had just 1. in a game where he had a career high 23 points, had the ball in his hands a lot, he had just one turnover. That is a huge development for Gonzaga. Nolan Hickman's ability to take better care of the basketball over the last couple of games has been monstrously critical for this team going forward. But Drew Timme still has turnover issues, and I'm not sure how much those are going to get fixed, certainly against lower level competition and the WCC against some of the opponents they'll face there. He's still going to get double teamed. He's still going to probably have some situations where he's a bit slow getting the pass out and maybe turns it over that way. But I'm expecting to not see very many more 7 turnover games, hopefully not too many more 5+ turnover games for Drew. But seeing the rest of the team really kind of handle the turnover issue against a pretty good team in Xavier. They're not an elite defensive team by any stretch of the imagination, but they're a good team. And for Gonzaga to be able to take really good care of the basketball against that team is a promising sign for what is to come for them going forward. With regards to Drew having a struggle in the first half, I'm not overly concerned about that. Drew Timme would have to have a lot of really bad games in a row or look very obviously hurt or different for me to be ultimately all that concerned. Xavier's got some size. Zach Fremantle, Jack Nunge, really good players. Nunge had, I think, 25 points in this one. He was an absolute monster. The Zags have an issue defending high-level posts, which is another thing that we're going to talk about more in the future segments or future episodes of the show, especially after Zach Edey did what Zach Edey did against the Zags for Purdue. And again, Nunge and Fremantle having nice games for Xavier as well. But overall, the Zags looked fantastic in this one. 54% from deep. They made 13 threes in this one, 13 of 24. Of course, we said Strawther went 5 of 8. Nolan Hickman went 4 of 7. We got a lot more conversation coming your way about Nolan Hickman in the second segment of today's show and the outstanding performances that he had in this game, as well as the game against Purdue. Rasir Bolden, Anton Watson, Ben Gregg each went 1 of 2 from deep. Hunter Salas knocked down a 3 as well. Really, really nice overall well-rounded performance from the Zags. They still got some issues that they need to work on. One thing we're going to talk about more on Tuesday's episode, but it's worth bringing up here, is the kind of disappearing act we have seen from transfer Malachi Smith in bigger games. He has played very, very well against Gonzaga's lower level competition. He had a great game against Portland State in Portland. He also had a very nice game against North Florida to kick off the season against the Ospreys at home. Against Gonzaga's better competition, against Michigan State, against Kentucky, against Texas, Purdue, and even Xavier, we just haven't really seen Malachi Smith be a big-time contributor. He does some good stuff, but he never really shows up in the box score, doesn't do a lot of scoring, didn't score in this one. And I think that Gonzaga needs another guard. They need another player who can come in, who can give them energy, who can give them contribution, who can stretch the floor, shoot from the outside, play good defense. All things that Malachi Smith has proven he is capable of doing against teams like Portland State, against teams like North Florida. He hasn't proven that he can be a big-time contributor against higher-level opponents. Typically, I don't look at the splits too often for this, because if players are good, they're going to be usually good against most levels of competition, but it is a pretty stark difference right now in how Malachi Smith is playing and even how he is being utilized against teams like this as opposed to some of the other teams that Gonzaga plays. It is something that I'm keeping a close eye on going forward, because if Malachi Smith's a big contributor for the Zags in the WCC season, but suddenly can't help them as much in March, that's going to be a problem for this team going forward. All right, there were a lot of ups and downs this week in Gonzaga land, including 2 players who flashed significant potential and improvement during their time in the Rose City. More on them and what it means for this team going forward. But first, I want to tell you all about Upside. From cringing at the pump to getting an eye-popping check at your favorite restaurant, inflation is hitting us all where it hurts, and it really hurts. That's why I started using Upside. Upside is an incredible app for anyone who buys gas, groceries, or dines out. With every purchase, I'm earning cash back thanks to Upside. The app is very easy to use, and there's no catch. To get started, download the free Upside app, use my promo code LOCKED, and you will get $5 or more cash back on your first purchase of $10 and up. Next, claim an offer for whatever you're buying on Upside. Check in at the business, pay as usual with a credit or debit card, and you get paid. In comparison to credit card rewards or loyalty programs, you can earn 3 times more cash back with Upside. Upside users are earning more than $1 million every week. That's part of why they have a 4.8 star rating on the App Store. Download the free Upside app and use promo code LOCKED to get $5 or more cash back on your first purchase of $10 and up. $5 or more cash back on your first purchase of $10 and up using code LOCKED. All right, today's episode is also brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, Every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people to hire for your team faster and for free. It's extremely simple to use. Start by adding your job in the purple #hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, Andy Patton here, Locked On Zags. Want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen of the day. For your second listen today, check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast. From the games that matter the most to the biggest stories in sports, go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with local experts and insights that only Locked On can provide. Locked On Sports Today, available on this app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. All right, two players we are talking about here in the second segment. I mentioned early on in the show that I tend to skew towards the positive. We will have plenty of conversation about Gonzaga's woes and flaws and some of the things they need to work on, especially leading up to a huge game against Baylor in Sioux Falls, South Dakota on Friday. But I want to talk about Gonzaga's point guard, Nolan Hickman, and the two performances that we saw from him against Purdue and Xavier, a sign of very, very promising things to come for the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Nolan Hickman was outstanding this weekend. Simply put, he was fantastic. And as much as he has been criticized early in the year, he needs to be praised when we do start to see those things come around, because we knew that this would happen. This was a big part of the conversation, is Nolan Hickman needs a little time. Gonzaga's schedule didn't afford players time to acclimate to the system. They hit the road hard immediately. They had their scrimmage game against Tennessee, which was televised. They had North Florida. They had the exhibition game against Warner Pacific, and then they had the North Florida game, and then, of course, they went straight into Michigan State. They played Texas. They played Kentucky. They had their gimme game against Portland State, and then Purdue and Xavier. It has been a really, really rough stretch for the Zags early on, and players who needed to acclimate to new roles, new players, Malachi Smith, Efton Reed, of course, and then players who are playing new positions. Julian Strawther's playing a little bit of a new position. Anton Watson's being asked to do a little bit more. Certainly Nolan Hickman and Hunter Salas are both being asked to do new things as well. So it's a team with a lot of players who are doing something different for the first time in their careers. And so you could see that shift starting to happen for some of these guys. You're seeing players get more comfortable. Certainly Anton Watson has been in that conversation. Julian Strawther dropping a career high against Xavier is a great sign for him getting more used to his role. But Nolan Hickman has been the player who's improved the most from the first start of the season until now. And it really showed up in both the Purdue and the Xavier game. Against Purdue, he had 15 points, 5 assists, and 1 steal. He was 6 for 11 from the field, 3 of 7 from deep. You like to see him being more aggressive, hunting his shot. He's looking for opportunities to score. He's distributing the basketball well, doing all of the little things right. Against Xavier, even more efficient in that one, 14 points and 5 assists. He also had 6 rebounds against the Musketeers, 5 of 10 from the field, and 4 of 7 from deep in that one. Really clutch shots against Xavier. He had a really, really big three-pointer after Xavier kind of hit Gonzaga pretty hard in the middle of the second half and ended up taking a pretty big lead after being down as much as 13 points. We've seen Gonzaga kind of squander leads in the past, and a couple times this year they didn't look so good trying to fight their way out of that. Against Purdue, you kind of saw them sort of make some moves to fight against it and try to come back in that game, and it ultimately fell short. There was some fear, some consternation among the fan base that it was going to happen again against Xavier. Rasir Bolton hit a nice 3, and the next possession down, I think Ben Gregg tipped it out, ended up swinging it over to Nolan Hickman, wide open in the corner. Bang! He hit a 3, a really clutch shot, and then Julian Strawther kind of carried them home after that. But against Purdue and Xavier, two good quality teams. Purdue's a top 10 team in the country. Xavier is not ranked right now, but is a legitimate player in the Big East, and a team that I think is going to get better as the year goes on. Nolan Hickman in those 2 games against those 2 opponents, 10 assists and 2 turnovers, 10-2 assist to turnover ratio. That is Andrew Nembhard-esque in terms of assist to turnover ratio. This is a huge development for Nolan Hickman and needs to be discussed, needs to be addressed, that he looked like the player Gonzaga needs him to be in those 2 games. He didn't just look good in games like North Florida, Portland State. It's not a Malachi Smith situation. He looked good against really good opponents. He took care of the basketball. He made the right decision in terms of when to pass up open shots, when to take open shots. He knocked down well over 40% of his three-pointers. He's shooting 44% on the season now. After an ugly start to this year shooting the basketball, Nolan Hickman through 6 games is now shooting 44% from deep. That is incredible. Obviously, it's a tiny sample size, but that is still really notable that Nolan Hickman, who's been criticized for not having that outside shot, for that not being an element of his game, is now shooting 44% from deep. He's been a steady presence. He's not trying to do too much. He's playing within himself. He's attacking the ball screens appropriately. He knows when to make that dump pass to Drew Timme. He knows when to take that little floater in the lane, which is an Andrew Nembhard specialty, something that he almost certainly picked up from him over the last year. And it has been just fantastic to see Hickman start to develop into that player that we know he's capable of being. The point guard that Gonzaga not just wants him to be, needs him to be that guy. Those lineups with Hunter Sallis bringing the ball up the court and immediately getting into just a motion offense at the top of the key. I don't mind that, and I think there are situations when that's really nice to be able to do, and having Hunter Sallis and his defensive instincts on the floor is great. But Gonzaga really, in order to really hum along and be as efficient as they can be, they need somebody engineering the train. They need a point guard who's kind of running the show and getting everything going and situated. Nolan Hickman proved against Xavier and Purdue that he can be that guy. Still got some stuff he needs to work on. He's only 2 for 2 from the free throw line this year. I would love to see him attack more, draw contact, get to the free throw line, find himself a way to get some more easy buckets that way. But it's hard to be too nitpicky after the last 2 games that we've seen from Nolan Hickman in a Gonzaga uniform. And then got to talk Ben Gregg. We have to talk about the biggest development for Gonzaga that we saw over this weekend in Portland, Oregon over Thanksgiving, and that is that Ben Gregg stole himself a rotation spot and looked pretty dang good doing it. Ben Gregg looked awesome this weekend. There's no other way to put it. Against Purdue, 9 points, 2 boards, 2 blocks in 9 minutes. 9 minutes of action. He finished with 2 blocks, 2 boards, and 9 points. Of course, he also finished with 5 fouls in that 9 minutes, hence why he only played that much. But that was kind of his role. I think players just straight up accepting the role that they are given is perfect. Ben Gregg was brought into the game to make life hard for Zach Edey as long as Ben Gregg was capable of making life hard for Zach Edey. That was his job. And do you know what? He did it really freaking well in this game. 2 of 5 from deep. You'd like to see a few more of those long distance shots go down. But you know what? I am totally content with Ben Gregg taking 5 threes in a 9-minute span. If I remember correctly, there was one of those threes that was like, okay, that was maybe not a great shot. The rest, good open looks. This is what he's on the team to do. He is on the team to stretch the floor, to give more spacing to Drew Timme or Efton Reed or whoever is playing in the middle, and to provide some level of energy boost on the defensive end of the floor. I have criticized Ben Gregg's defense on this podcast before, and I will eat my words in the sense that he looked awesome in this game. I still think he's got plenty of work to do defensively, but who doesn't? Especially young bigs. It's just hard to get to find yourself on that end of the floor. I mean, a lot of Gonzaga's best defensive players weren't good at it right away. Shemek Karnowski really struggled early on. We're seeing Efton Reed go through similar struggles. For Ben to kind of start to be finding that role, get himself a couple of blocks, make life difficult for Zach Edey. Yeah, I don't mind that he fouled out in 9 minutes. I really don't, because I think that was kind of what he was supposed to do on the court, was make life as difficult for Edey as he possibly could while giving some contribution on the offensive end of the floor, which he did perfectly. And then the Xavier game was truly the breakout. And it's funny because you look at the box score, he only had 3 points. He only played 13 minutes. It doesn't look like this really big, dramatic breakthrough type performance for Ben Gregg necessarily. But watching the game, I mean, first of all, the 3-pointer that he hit, the 3 points that he got was right at the end of the half. Gonzaga was losing momentum. Really didn't have any going into halftime. It looked like they were going to kind of limp to the finish line to finish out the first half, which we've seen them do a handful of times this year already. Then Ben Gregg hit what looked like the 29-foot 3-pointer, absolute cash, nothing but net, sent the Zags into halftime with the 6-point lead, gave them some momentum. Those were the only points of the game, but he also had 6 rebounds, including 3 offensive rebounds for a stretch of time in the second half. Ben Gregg was everywhere. He was everywhere on the court. He was, every time the ball bounced off the rim, it seemed like it was coming up in his hands. He had a couple tap backs like this. I think he tapped one back that ended up being a play that swung around to Nolan Hickman for a really clutch 3 in the midpoint of the second half, when Gonzaga was kind of getting through Xavier's blows and ended up taking the lead and never relinquishing it after that. This is the best stretch that Ben Gregg has played in a Gonzaga uniform. And it's not particularly close, to be honest. He hasn't played in very many games against high-level opponents. And Mark Few acknowledged that after the game. He said, playing in these games is a privilege. It is not a right. And he's acknowledging that if I'm giving you minutes against a team like Xavier in a game that we want to win for, to get to third place finish, to not drop another game this season, if I'm playing you in those games, it is not because I feel obligated to play you or because, whatever situation, you're just the next guy up. It is a privilege. If you don't deserve to play, he will not play you. He's made that very clear throughout, not just in words, but like through the way that he has coached for the last 20 years. So he believed Ben Gregg was ready to help and contribute to this team right at that moment. And he was right, because Ben Gregg did. Ben Gregg played awesome in this game. Efton Reed, 1 minute of action in this game. And look, I like Efton Reed, and I think Efton Reed is going to be a player who contributes to this team in a fairly significant way at some point. I am becoming less optimistic that will really even happen this year. I think we will see better days are ahead for Efton Reed this year. I don't think that we have seen like the most of him for the entire season. He's not going to get entirely just buried on the bench, but Ben Gregg is ahead of him on the depth chart right now, and I would be shocked if that changes. I would be surprised if that changes. And considering how well Anton Watson is playing, considering how much the Zags are utilizing Julian Strawther in that small ball 4 role, your rotation up front becomes kind of Drew Timme, Anton Watson, Julian Strawther, and then Ben Gregg. And that might be it. That might be all we get. So Efton Reed could end up finding himself in a situation where he's not playing very often. Maybe he gets some more garbage time minutes going forward. But I think Ben has earned the opportunity to play. Right now, the Efton Reed, Drew Timme lineups do not work. There's not enough spacing. There's not enough outside shooting. Defensively, it's a bit of a mess. Ben Gregg still has some work to do on the defensive end of the floor, but he's doing it. He's working really hard on that end of the floor. He just manhandled Zach Edey. If you can do that for a few minutes in a game, you're going to be prepared to handle the big men you're going to see in the WCC and going forward this season. So Ben is going to be that guy. He's going to fill that role. And I don't know how big of a role this will be. It kind of will depend on matchups. It'll depend on the situation. But when the Zags need a big man, and it can't be Anton or Drew or even Julian, I don't think they're turning to Reed right away. They're turning to Ben Gregg. And I think Ben's going to hold that role for the rest of the season. And I'm really excited for him. I think he does a lot of really good things. Again, the lineup with him and Drew Timme on the floor at the same time is really, really nice because of the spacing. Gives Drew more room to operate down low. Well, the AP poll is going to look a lot different on Monday. We discussed where Gonzaga might end up and where they should end up. But first, our partners at Nissan have worked with us to create a new segment across the Locked On Podcast Network called Thrilling Moments, where we highlight the most exciting play from the Zags' latest game or throughout the team's history. Against Xavier on Sunday was all Julian Strawther down the stretch as he hit a pair of clutch threes to ice the game for the Bulldogs and secure a third-place finish in the highly competitive PK85. This segment has been inspired by the thrilling new designs featured across Nissan's new lineup of vehicles. Pursue what thrills you in the all-new Frontier, Armada, or Pathfinder today. Available now at nissanusa.com. All right, segment 3, still Edey Patton, still Locked On Zags. And guess what, guys? The AP poll is going to look a lot different this week. So many things have happened in college basketball. It's been such a strange season already, and I think there's a much larger conversation to be had about how the transfer portal has altered how early season college basketball looks, and we're seeing teams be more aggressive with their schedule, specifically Gonzaga, of course, because that is who we all see on a daily basis. They have played a rigorous non-conference schedule. We've seen Michigan State do similar as well, and we've seen a handful of other high-profile programs are doing similar things, or at least were playing in big games this past weekend in the Feast Week, and we saw a lot of upsets. We saw a lot of teams lose games that we did not expect to see them lose. And certainly it has shaken up what is going to be a very new looking AP top 5 on Monday. Of course, Gonzaga and North Carolina began the season in the 1 and 2 spot. Both those teams now have 2 losses on the year. Gonzaga's, of course, to Texas and Purdue. North Carolina lost to Iowa State, who ended up finishing second on their side of the PK bracket behind UConn. North Carolina also lost a 4 overtime game to Alabama that I was fortunate enough to be at. Spent my entire Sunday afternoon watching North Carolina's guard Caleb Love just shoot shot after shot after shot after shot. He finished that game with 36 shot attempts, which is pretty unheard of. Of course, 4 overtime games, you're going to see some inflated numbers, but that was still a ridiculous contest for the Tar Heels. Pete Nance and Armando Bacot are two big men. They're both very, very talented players, but they have struggled to find ways to play those two guys at the same time because of their defensive deficiencies, I guess is the best way to put it, and just their kind of spacing on the offensive end. So that's something to keep an eye on with North Carolina. They're not going to be in the top 10, probably not even in the top 15, despite starting the season at number 1. Houston is probably going to be the number 1 team in the country, and I think that they deserve it. They have been very, very good this year. The Cougs are a fantastic program, but they also scored 49 points against Kent State, who Gonzaga plays on December 5th. So we have seen them struggle in a significant way. Their biggest non-conference victory right now is a true road win at Oregon. Oregon has not looked all that good, even though Oregon, with just 6 scholarship players, managed to defeat Villanova, who finished 8th out of 8 on their side of the bracket in the Phil Knight Invitational. Villanova coach Kyle Neptune having a really rough start to his tenure after Jay Wright's departure for the Wildcats. Of course, Villanova is missing freshman Cam Whitmore and star Justin Moore are both out with injuries, but another team that was expected to be in that top 10, top 15 conversation that is now not even really close to that conversation right now. Then you have Kansas. They lost to Tennessee. Tennessee, obviously a very good program. No shame there. But Kansas also only beat Wisconsin by 1 point. Wisconsin has not looked very good this season. So it has been a really interesting week at the top of the AP poll. Coming out right now, I think the top 5. I'm going to give you what I think my top 5 is going to be and where I think Gonzaga is going to be. We're just going to talk a little bit about whether ratings matter all of that much. For me, my top 5 right now, Houston Cougars number 1, followed by Gonzaga's least favorite team right now, the Texas Longhorns at number 2. Texas has played one of the easiest schedules outside of Gonzaga amongst the top 10 teams in KenPom right now, but they haven't lost, and the one good team they've played, they blew them out, so you got to give Texas some credit right now. Number 3 for me is Tony Bennett's Virginia Cavaliers. They are also undefeated. They have the 5th highest ranked offense in the entire country per KenPom, 15th highest defense. Both fantastic numbers. Very surprising to see Virginia with a better offense than defense. That is unusual for them. Number 4 is my 3rd team from the great state of Texas, the Baylor Bears. Scott Drew's team, always a dangerous one, and will be even better as Keontae George, their star freshman, kind of finds himself and finds his game a little bit as the season goes on. And then number 5, the Tennessee Volunteers, the only team with actually Baylor and Tennessee both have losses, but Tennessee, a team that has just looked really, really good at times this year, and I think has a legitimate chance to be a number 1 overall seed in a team that we could see playing in a Final Four or even a national championship. Those are the teams that I have in the top 5. A couple teams that just missed. Purdue has to be in this conversation. They were 24th last week, but to beat Gonzaga by 19 points, they beat Duke by 19 points. Do you know how many times 2 top 10 teams have been beat by 19 points on consecutive days by the same team? Once, and it was like in 1968, I believe. I saw this on ESPN stats. So what an incredible run for for Purdue. Zach Edey looks like the legitimate player of the year candidate. He looks like the best player in college basketball right now. And so for them, I don't know that they're going to jump from 24 into the top 5. I don't know if they should necessarily, but they're clearly one of the 10 best teams in college basketball, the way that they played in those 2 games, and they're going to remain in that conversation. Arizona and UConn are the other 2 teams that I kind of want to talk about here. UConn blew out Iowa State to win their version of the PK Invitational. They're a top 20 team who should be in the top 8, top 5 potentially. I've seen a few places have them outside the top 10, but Adama Sanogo is just so good for that team. Tristan Newton, triple-double earlier in the year, has been fantastic for the Huskies. And then, of course, Tommy Lloyd's Arizona squad, after losing Ben Mathurin, Dallin Terry, and Christian Koloko to the NBA to turn it around with Azuolas Tubelis, with Pelle Larsson, with Omar Ballo stepping up in a really big way. He had 30 points for them very recently. He's been fantastic, and Tommy's got that team absolutely rolling. For the Zags, I think they're going to be in the 10 to 15 range, and I think that feels about right to me. I think that's about where they should be. KenPom has them 9th. I think 9th is pretty good. I would be surprised if they are 9th in the AP poll, just because they had 2 pretty big losses on their resume. It doesn't look like they beat Xavier by all that much. It doesn't look like they beat Michigan State by all that much, because they didn't in either of those games. But I think that those wins should count a fair amount because of how difficult it was to come back and secure those victories. But I think Gonzaga is probably a top 10 team in terms of talent in the college basketball right now, but they're not playing like a top 10 team, to be clear. They're not playing like a top 20 team for the most part this season. I think that they're going to get there. I think talent tends to win out. But right now, if I was making an AP poll, I think I would probably have them 11th, 12th, somewhere in that conversation. Again, we kind of talked about some of the other teams that are going to be up in there. Kentucky's still going to be in there as well. Alabama's going to be in that conversation. Arkansas is going to be in that conversation. You got to figure out something to do with Duke and North Carolina as well. So it's going to be an interesting AP poll. I think there's a lot of teams that are kind of, there's nobody who really wants to be number one, but there's a lot of teams that want to be in that like 5 to 10 range. Gonzaga, I think, is just outside of that range. Obviously, a win over Baylor would help in a significant way to bump them back into that top 5 conversation. But even if they don't win that game, I think they'll remain ranked going into conference play. It just might be a little lower than Gonzaga fans are used to. All right, that's going to do it for me today. Mailbag Monday is going to be a day late on Tuesday this week, so don't miss that. Get your questions submitted to me as soon as you can, if you have not already. Also, check out my new podcast, Locked On College Basketball. It's a national show all about college hoops with myself and co-host Isaac Shade. It is available wherever you get podcasts as well as on YouTube. All right, thank you all for listening, and go Zags.